Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's experiment, which asks, is it possible to program somebody to kill without them realizing it? Conspiracy theorists claim that the CIA hypnotized unsuspecting candidates to carry out assassinations in the 50s and in the 60s, most notably that of Senator Robert Kennedy. Tonight, we'll find out if that's even possible or the stuff of movie fiction. Those are not actually my words, they are the words of Darren Brown. And Darren Brown actually has conducted two very, very significant experiments, which we actually must take very careful cognizance of, because are these experiments actually telling us what the establishment is more than capable of doing? Sirhan, who allegedly was responsible for the murder of Sir Robert Kennedy, in an interview, he said, "Obviously, I was there, but I don't remember the exact moment I pulled the gun from my body or wherever I had it hidden. And I don't remember pulling the trigger or aiming it at any human being." Now, Darren Brown, earlier this year in January, ran an experiment where there were 4 people who were conditioned to push an executive of a charity off of the top of a building. And this is how it was reported in the Mail. The illusionist Darren Brown persuades 2 ordinary women to push a stranger off a roof. But could you be talked into murder? Well, here's the picture. It's a screenshot from that program, and it's one of the women, I think her name was Laura, who responded to the conditioning and did indeed push this gentleman off of the building. And you can see this program online. Just search for Darren Brown Assassin. And the program actually focuses on the 28-year-old male who did actually do his level best to resist the program and actually refused to push this man off of a building. But 2 of the women in the experiment did indeed do that. Now, later in the program, we'll be talking about another experiment that Darren Brown conducted, which is perhaps even more sinister. Now, obviously, this coincidentally relates to recent events in the UK. But these are not unique events, because this type of event, a political assassination, where there has been a political agenda, or even if there was no political agenda, the politicians who never let a good crisis go to waste have certainly politicized that event. So I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by an outstanding researcher by the name of Ole Dammegard. Now, Ole is a Danish by birth, but grew up in Sweden, and today lives in the warmer climes around the Mediterranean. So, Ole, thank you very much for taking time out from the Mediterranean evening sun and joining me here on Humanity vs. Insanity.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's a real pleasure and honor.
Well, the reason, obviously, I've asked you to join me tonight is because you have, for the last, couple of decades or so at least, dedicated yourself to really digging into the deeper agenda behind a number of, shall I say, questionable global events. And tonight I want to focus on a couple of events from not your country of birth, but the country in which you grew up in, Sweden, because Sweden has experienced 2 quite significant political assassinations over the last 30 years. One in 1986 and one more recently in 2003. But let's start with the first one, and that is the assassination of Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, in 1986. So, Ole, can you give us a bit of background and your insight into why it was that Olof Palme was murdered?
Well, like you say, I spent some 30 years looking into major assassinations and false flag operations, so-called state-sponsored terrorism. And Olof Palme is an assassination, and I normally try to avoid answering in a quick answer because it's extremely complicated. It's a massive, massive conspiracy that is given to us as the work of a lone crazy guy. And I tell you, every time we're being served a lone crazy guy, that is a sign be alert, because the powers behind these operations want us to believe that it's a lone crazy guy. And the reason for that is if that person is alone, then by law, there's no conspiracy and it can be dealt with in a totally different way. And if the person is mad or is an extremist, then that's the motive or no motive at all. So in these cases, very often this person gets killed or is suicided right after, meaning case closed, thank you folks, and goodbye. But when you look at cases like what has recently happened in the UK and so on, this is not unique in any way or form. And these cases very often happen right before a major election into something major for that country or on a global scale. And when I would suggest that when you look at these elections, very often the power structure behind them wants us to choose their way. And if they can't get us to do it, then if they can't force us with logic or through media to go their way, then at a last attempt, they try to do it emotionally. And they hit somebody. Most normal is someone where the emotion gets high, like children, women. These are the two that really works. And especially women, a young woman, good looking with young children, that is the main one for them, because that can really get us normal people going. And the idea is then that by hitting this innocent, beautiful, strong person that stood up for all these beautiful ideals, by hitting them, then people that otherwise would have been against whatever she stood for will join out of support and sympathy for the family of the victim and so on. And this is exactly what we saw in Sweden when Sweden was being pushed, or they tried to push us into the euro, because in Sweden it was a matter of the currency, change it from the Swedish krona into the euro. And 2 days before the election, she was murdered.
This is Anna Lindh.
Anna Lindh, yes.
Anna Lindh, yeah, and she was she was 46 years of age.
46, yes.
And as you say, she was good looking, a beautiful woman, married, 2 children. And she was the foreign minister, I believe, at the time.
She was the foreign minister, and very, very popular and very strong individual. And by killing her, then the opposition against the euro just weakened extremely. And it almost came to a point where Sweden voted yes. But now, instead, in the end, they decided to stay for the krona and still are. So here we have another very important election, the Britain going in or out of the European Union. And 2 days before, or just a few days before, boom, a very, very similar attack with a knife and a gun, very dramatic, in an open place, same type of person. They almost look alike, beautiful, young, a successful woman with 2 children and a supporting family, standing up for many of these beautiful values that most people think are good. And then, boom, something awful, awful like this happens. And right away, we're being given the assassin being an extremist, a loner, for Britain against all traitors, and then, boom.
Well, let's go back and talk about Anna Lindh and her assassin. I mean, there's a couple of other similarities as well. And of course, not only was Anna Lindh a very popular politician, she was also very much an outspoken critic of Israel. And in fact, we see here a picture of her with Yasser Arafat. And I mean, as we also know, and I did a program about this in March of this year, joining the terror dots. it became very apparent that criticism of Israel is high risk to not only high-profile politicians, but also to nations that openly challenge the Zionist agenda of total dominion in the Middle East.
Yep, I can only say that over the last few years, I mean, it's very, very dominant. This, if you stand up about, if you become pro-Palestinian or you stand up for Palestine, boom, it hurts. They knock you back, and they statue examples, and this goes for individuals as well as nations. And I would say that the whole series of terror acts that was carried out in 2015 had that theme under the surface, very, very strong.
So, but with Anna Lindh now, I mean, she was pro going into the euro,
yeah.
And so it would appear perhaps that the attempt on, well, not an attempt, the successful assassination of Anna Lindh was to tug the emotional heartstrings of the Swedes to actually get them to support what she was campaigning for, i.e. to go into the euro.
Exactly.
And obviously so close to the referendum, just because it was, the attack was 4 days before, I think, and then she died the following day. So it was very, very close to the referendum. And of course, as you rightly reminded me, she actually died on 9/11 of 2003, so 2 years after the fateful day, which really did change the whole global agenda.
Yep, true.
So now the other interesting coincidence is the name of her assassin, because her assassin, like Sirhan Sirhan, i.e. Sirhan squared, her assassin was Mikhail Mihailovich.
Yeah, alleged assassin.
Alleged assassin, yes.
Alleged, yeah, because when you see these cases, it's like if you take Sirhan Sirhan, totally, I would say, yes, mind-controlled, because just like you say, he has absolutely no memory of the whole thing. His whole behavior before and how he was treated, pulled into this whole thing. When you see the assassination itself, he was standing right in front of Bobby Kennedy when he pulled out this gun. The gun had 8 bullets in it, but up to 13 shots were fired. And as soon as he started firing, people around Bobby Kennedy jumped him, grabbed his arm, put him down on a steam table, and got the gun from him while he was still trying to fire it. But 8 shots in the gun, 13 shots fired. And where did all the bullets hit Bobby Kennedy? Straight from the front? Nope. Straight from the back to the right. All 3 shots that hit him came from very close, almost point blank, behind and to the right.
And how many of the 8 shots in Sirhan Sirhan's gun were actually fired?
There are different, what do you call it?
Accounts.
Theories about this. Yeah, because they keep changing. So I can't say for sure. But anyway, 8 shots and 13 fired. You can't make that up even. And then the whole police investigation afterwards was totally focused on him and not trying to find out where did the shots actually come from. Also, all the places where there were bullet holes, like in the ceiling and in around the door and so on, these things were taken down and destroyed, together with more than 2,000 photos from the crime site and so on, were destroyed as well. So, I mean, this is the sign of somebody who's trying to cover their tracks. And when Anna Lindh was killed, there this extreme delay often after these type of operation. The normal police work, the CCTV cameras doesn't work. Everything is delayed. And exactly the same thing happened after Anna Lindh. And there was no, like the police chief, she went home 10 o'clock that evening, and the person who was on standby for her didn't even turn up to her job, even though this was an attack on the nation. I mean, the second most horrible murder in Sweden up to date. So the whole lameness of the police, and also the the person who was in charge of security at that warehouse, or that it's a big store with like a mall type of thing, with many clothes shops and so on, where she went to buy clothes actually for an interview just before the election. She needed the clothes for that TV interview. And the guy in charge for security, he was a former police officer who was one of the people pointing out for being a part of the assassination of Olof Palme some years earlier. So you got many of the key people that are in more than one of these dramas. Also, one of the people driving the ambulances was part of taking care of another person, military inspector called Fredrik Algernon, who knew too much about the assassination of Olof Palme and ended up dead in front of a subway train. The same ambulance driver there as with Anna Lindh, and so on. So I would say there's a lot of things pointing to a small group. And then also the evidence around Anna Lindh, they went through the clothes of this Mikhail Mikhailovich was not the first guy they tried to nail, but once they got him, they did everything they could. And his clothes, everything was, they went through it very, very carefully, not finding anything. And then 2 days later, suddenly there was this tag from the upcoming election in one of his back pockets that hadn't been found before, and also, so suddenly we have evidence that appears after the crime scene has been cleared, the clothes has been cleared, and so on. These things are extremely important to notice, because then suddenly we're pointing at someone innocent.
Yeah, who's effectively the patsy that's been identified either prior or in the immediate aftermath. And now it's interesting that you make the observation about the small cast of players. I mean, it's almost like there's a cleanup team, isn't there? So that when something of this order of magnitude goes down, obviously you've got to be sure, if it is something that has been contrived, you've got to make sure that all the players are basically on board and that nobody's going to break ranks, so that those that do know are the trusted ones, and those who find out are effectively warned that any stray comment could be somewhat life-limiting.
This is it. From time to time, they statue examples, just to tell people, back off. We can get anyone anywhere at any time. It's a statement, a very violent statement. So I totally agree with that.
Now, there's one aspect of Mikhail Mihailovich that I want to touch on. Let me go back to this report from 2011, where it says that the 32-year-old Mihailovich admitted in an extensive interview with Expressen newspaper back in August 2011 that he had not planned the assassination, but did it on impulse after seeing the foreign minister at the time outside the NK department store in Stockholm. He said he then followed her around several stories of the shop on September the 10th before the fatal stabbing which rocked society and changed Swedish politics. High on the hypnotic drug flunitrazepam at the time, Milanovic told how he tracked down Lynn and eventually caught up with her and stabbed her in a Philippa K concession. Now, what is interesting here is the combination. High on the SSRI, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so effectively an antidepressant, I believe, and also that in his mind, it was impulse. But do you think there is any possibility that he had effectively been pre-programmed to respond to some kind of trigger, be that a word or a visual trigger, that would actually set him off on this course of action? And then, like Sirhan, he wouldn't have any memory of actually carrying out the event afterwards.
Yeah. I want to say, first of all, this thing that they said about this drug, he wasn't caught until days and days later. So how can they say that he was on this drug? This has never been medically, it's just something that they put forward weeks later. Okay, so that you can't trust. Then when you look at the CCTV camera footage, that went down. There was no photos of the guy. It was afterwards. The description of the guy, different clothes, he wasn't the same type of build that the witnesses said, and so on. Also, the police came there. They were not looking. It took more than a day for them to even ask for the CCTV footage from there, from the stores, and from the subway, which is very close. So there was no desire to find out the real truth. And I would say when you really look at it, it looks like there was a team of 5 to 6 people that carried out that assassination, similar dressed and so on. And when these hits take place, very, very often, I would say, they don't trust mind-controlled people to carry the thing out. They will have multiple shooters or multiple people involved with option 1, 2, 3, and so on, so that they really get the victim, because the victim needs to die. That is the main thing. And then the mind-controlled person is the one that would take the fall for it. And then with Mikhail Mikhailovich, what he says, that he heard this voice, he was driven by this voice in his head. But often also you can see with these mind-controlled people, like Mark Chapman at the John Lennon assassination, he was not the real shooter. The real shooter was Jose Perdomo, a man from a very ultra-secret hit team called Operation 40. He was the doorman at the time. But Mark Chapman, who is blamed for the John Lennon assassination, he was the same type of thing where it's like a story has been implanted in their head. So they're almost like, it's almost on a loop where they say the same story again and again and again. And they become, after the hit, they are almost like zombies. They're just standing there waiting to be picked up.
Well, let's go back to that report again, because this is also an interesting point you make, because that report that I read from Expressen continues where Mikhail Mihailovich says, I just went up, took out the knife, and it happened there. It happened so fast. I remember that the atmosphere was chaotic, very crowded, and someone yelled, catch him. I remembered there was a lot of shouting, blah, blah, blah. He said, despite the attack happening in a crowded shop in broad daylight, Mihailovich managed to flee the scene, much to his surprise. Now, so to take your point, there is the possibility that he wasn't even there. And if that's the case, then this version of events was possibly implanted in his memory, creating a false memory after the event. Is that a possible scenario?
God, yeah, this is standard procedure. I'm not a fan of science fiction movies or theories like that, but these are facts. You can find out the MK Ultra version that was in the 50s and 60s. It has changed names many, many times over the years and become extremely sophisticated nowadays to a level that I have no idea about. But really, even in the early 50s and late 60s, they were talking about, or professors that were working with this were claiming that they could get innocent people or patsies they split the personality to a lot of different horror things. They kept them awake, they tortured them, everything to split up the personality into different sections. And these different sections could then be activated by keywords and so on. This is what you see in Hollywood productions, but that's actually the truth. And also already in the 50s, they claimed that they could get the assassin to totally forget what he carried out, or they could plant whatever story they wanted in him, making that his memory. So I believe Mikhailovich was totally innocent to that. He's still in prison. But he believes now, after being prepared by these guys, that he did it because he's being told again and again and again. So does Mark Chapman. He also believes it. But when you look at the forensic evidence on site, Mark Chapman wasn't even standing anywhere near from the site to the left of where Lennon was, where the shots were fired. It was fired straight from the left and very close range. And Mark Chapman was standing like 3-4 meters behind him and to the right.
And there's always some interesting connections, isn't there? Because I think you just triggered a memory with me. Wasn't Mark Chapman, his brother was very good friends with one of the Bushes?
The Bush family keeps popping up everywhere, I tell you. It was the same with with the guy who attempted to kill Reagan as well. Family ties.
Now, I was just going to mention that because, interestingly enough, the Reagan assassination. I mean, people say, oh, you know, these are just sort of rampant conspiracies. But what a lot of people are not aware of is that an exercise was actually planned the following day after the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. And the exercise, the script of the exercise, was based on the president being assassinated and the vice president, of course, who was George Herbert Walker Bush at the time, the vice president being sworn in to take his place.
And this was the whole idea with the assassination attempt. And do you know there was an identical script just before the assassination of Olof Palme, where the scenario was the Swedish prime minister shot dead. And this was unheard of in 1986. I mean, Sweden was the most peaceful country in the world. Nobody could even make that up, you know, and then it actually happened. And then the scenario was already there with people taking part of the assassination itself that had been working on that drill.
Well, let's come back now.
I tell you, Ian, it keeps repeating. It is the same that keeps repeating. And nowadays, I'm a friend of Chip Tatum, who was he was the commander of George Bush Sr.'s private hit team called Pegasus, an ultra-secret hit team that carried out some 14 assassinations in Western Europe. He has since then become a whistleblower and is doing everything he can to redeem himself. And through him, I've been able to get a lot of information that is otherwise not let out there. And he claims that the world, he totally backs me in my so-called theories about many of these assassinations. I'm not really interested in theories. I'm totally focused on facts. But he claims that the world of assassins is extremely small globally. It is the same people, a very small group of very skilled people that are being used again and again and again and again when it comes to real assassinations. But nowadays we are in such a strange situation because there are real assassinations, real terror acts, and false flag operations with staged events, with staged assassination and so on. So it's very confusing sometimes when things like this happen.
I mean, the events in the US have, I mean, although, of course, the British media and every other media presents them as per the official story, but, you know, increasingly there is a very, very widespread community that takes these exercises apart. And of course, the most recent one is Orlando, where, I mean, like Sandy Hook, it does seem that these were exercises that went live, and then the script was effectively converted to a mainstream media script for public consumption. And of course, in every case, it is to forward a political agenda, which in the US is gun control.
Yep. It is behind these, behind the mass shootings, gun control. Behind terror attacks, it's the New World Order. And both of them go hand in hand. I mean, gun control is part of the New World Order. So it's just different symptoms of the same disease.
So let's go then and take a look at what happened in the UK. And obviously it's still early days. So, you know, there's a lot of information that has yet to emerge. But again, you know, the wonderful thing is that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of people that are all over this and taking it apart. Now, obviously, you know, it's a tragedy. And yet again, a young politician, a mother of two children, has lost her life in the quest for a political agenda. And let's just take a look at some of the things that have occurred in the days there, because it's very evident that the establishment wants Britain to remain in the EU. I do believe they have a plan for if Britain comes out, and I think that you know, that's something I've presented elsewhere, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think primarily their plan A, if you like, is to keep Britain in the EU. And last Tuesday, so a week ago tomorrow, This was the front page of The Sun. Now, The Sun is, I'm going to use the word newspaper loosely, but The Sun is the most widely read daily tabloid in the UK. It has a print run of, I think, pushing 3 million, and it's allegedly read, and again, I'll use that term loosely, by something in the region of close around about 10 to 11 million people. So it's a very, very influential organ. So this was the headline. So, pushing it right in, I was on the newsstands, believe in Britain. And, from this point, the polls suddenly turned and it went from a remain in the EU, lead in the polls, to leave. And in fact, the jump was quite significant. And then the following day, the Swiss Parliament formalised the decision that I think they had pretty much come to in March. But this formalised the decision that Switzerland would effectively cancel its application to join the EU, which it had actually had sitting out there since 1992. But in fact, one of the Swiss politicians basically said that to join the EU now is such that only lunatics will want to join it. So all of this was combining to make it look like the Leave campaign was probably going to walk it with a very, very significant majority. Now, sadly, those of us who do follow the geopolitics and the agenda, it's a script, as you have said yourself, that is well worn. And back in April, I made the observation in a newsletter that I sent out that if things were going in the opposite way to that which the establishment, the global establishment, wanted them to go, then we could expect to see a forced flag event in the run-up to the EU referendum in the UK. Now, at this stage of the game, I'm not suggesting that this was forced flag. It's certainly far too early to really pin it down. But it is the same script. And you made the observation yourself that, the pattern is to pick on a beautiful young woman, a charismatic young woman. She's with the family, and, it tugs on the heartstrings, which it's meant to do. And, we're not being unsympathetic, but, somewhere we have to retain some degree of objectivity, because the EU referendum, any referendum, I mean, like the Swedish referendum, it's not an election. It's not like you get another opportunity in 5 years' time to vote differently and vote somebody else in. This is a referendum that is going to have to last for probably a generation plus. It might even be the final referendum ever, because the handover of power to Brussels after this may be so absolute that there's no possibility of any further participation. So they wanted to get that result. So from what you've been seeing from afar, with the reports that have been making their way into the international arena, and of course we have Thomas Mayer here, who is the alleged perpetrator of this crime. And of course, he showed that he wasn't necessarily in a set of sound mental or psychological condition when he was asked for his name in court, and he said, "Death to the traitors." So, what is your perspective on this, sitting looking at it from 1,000 miles away?
Do you know, like the mass shooting at the Utøya in Norway, where there was a lot of, it was the worst mass murder committed by one person since the Second World War. That was just before Norway was going to pull out of NATO. It was just before, and after that, they were pro-Palestinian. There were elections going on there, and boom, this happened. And suddenly, Norway from wanting to pull out. After that, suddenly they were back in line. They were part of bombing of many different countries and so on. And after that, the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was very central in this whole drama in Norway, became the next leader, General Secretary of NATO. Here we have another very similar situation just before a very, very important referendum, like you say. I don't agree with you with these referendum being a one-off, because if you look at countries like Denmark and Sweden, they've done several referendums, and it's so like they keep doing that until the population gives them the way they want it. They just, after a few years, they repeat it until, and they did that in Denmark. And I remember there was one Bilderberg who said that we would just have kept on until the population gave us the option we wanted. So here, the target is following the template exactly. Young, beautiful, fantastic woman being hit, innocent, in the streets, among normal people. That makes the population feel vulnerable as well, and more emotional, because she was one of us. And then right away, you have somebody that fits into this I mean, right away, his behavior, the way what he says, what he's claimed to have said right after or while he was killing this woman. When you listen to the witnesses, some of the people close by, they say they did not hear him scream, just to the trade and whatever. But that is what is being pumped out in media. The way photos of him in military outfit, the drawings of him in court, making him looking like an absolute perfect person who have committed this, I would be very, very skeptical before I buy this, and really, really look deeply into this before I say anything that would support the official story. And also, which is extremely important in these cases, ask yourself, who benefits from me getting into the emotional state that they want me to? What behind this awful, awful crime, what kind of response is it the one behind this crime wants me to to get into? And I think
well, that's very concerning as well, because, I mean, what we're seeing in the UK right now is really a very sad turn of events, where people who certainly I would have considered to be very rational have now become somewhat irrational. And what we're seeing is a whipped up frenzy. And it's reaching the point where some people who I wouldn't normally have expected to react in this way, are now basically saying that anybody who wants to exit the EU is xenophobic, is a racist, and they're trying to demonize all the people that are voting or have the intention of voting to leave the EU. And of course, this is very emotive, and I know for a fact that some people have stated that they will now vote Remain just because they are scared of the reaction of the people that have become, whipped up by the emotions surrounding this event. And of course, this is exactly the reaction that the establishment wants. So sadly, these game makers, they know how to manipulate. They are masters at it. And sadly, those people who find themselves resorting to this xenophobia, racist, or any other extremist type accusation of those who want to leave the EU are effectively being played like violins.
Yep, I can totally agree. I mean, this is the thing. And can I just point out also that do you remember the Madrid bombings in 2004 on the 3rd of the 11th of March? This was just a few days before the elections in Spain. This is being carried out again and again and again. You have Pim Fortuyn in Holland, in the Netherlands. He was killed just 9 days before elections and so on. This is the way they play the game. And they know how you will react They know how the masses will react. That's why they do it. And they do it so openly, so blatant once you see the pattern. So they just repeat the same recipe again and again because most of us will just follow without thinking.
Well, what's interesting is that I saw today that on quite a mainstream website, Zero Hedge, and this was one of the articles posted this morning. It said there is a disturbing opinion circulating about Jo Cox and that she may have been assassinated to prevent a Brexit vote. And the journalist writes, many are starting to believe there is a conspiracy plot connecting the dots to ensure a sympathy vote to remain within the EU. People are pointing to the familiar tool of assassination often used to achieve political agendas. And that article had this graph which showed the phenomenal swing towards the Remain option. And of course, this isn't about xenophobia or racism. In fact, the UK is like all countries on mainland Europe now, the UK is multicultural and it's always going to be multicultural now. The issue is about democracy. The issue is about handing over the last vestiges of self-determination to a faceless bureaucracy that does not have the interests of any of the nation states at heart. It is a federalist organisation that is the next step towards the global structure, which of course will come in hiding under the guise of a trade agreement. This is going to be TTIP, of course, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But Ollie, in the last few minutes that we have to discuss this, I just want to draw people's attention to this. This is a screenshot from another Darren Brown experiment. And this is the experiment that I was actually referring to in my opening statement. And this is the experiment where Darren Brown programmed this young man to assassinate Stephen Fry, who's a rather well-known thespian in the UK. And this is the moment in which he pulls out the weapon. This is the moment that Stephen Fry reacts to the supposed impact. Of course, it wasn't a real assassination. It was a totally staged event. And then here is the young man in discussion with Darren Brown and with Stephen Fry. And they're playing back the video. And you can see this. It's all online. It's all on Darren Brown's video channel. So, all you got to do is search for Darren Brown assassin. And this is the young man watching the events on film with no recollection of having been in possession of a weapon, having no recollection of having pulled the trigger. And it wasn't until Darren Brown effectively touched him on the leg and brought the memories back into his consciousness that he had any recall. Now, this is what is served up as entertainment. And if anybody thinks for 1 minute that what you're seeing as entertainment isn't being used by those who really have much more to gain, and of course they've demonstrated that they'll pretty much do whatever it takes to achieve their ends, then this should not be dismissed as entertainment. Have you actually seen this, Ollie?
I have, and I mean, it's almost describing Sirhan's life, I would say. I mean, this is exactly what he's saying. When he sees this, he says, I know I was there because I've seen myself there, but no recollection whatsoever. But I had to point out once again, just to pull a trigger, just to get someone to shoot at someone doesn't mean that they can actually kill that person. It's more difficult than most people think to actually kill someone for sure. So they use skilled killers, hired assassins to really carry it out. And then people like this poor guy would be the fall guy. So also, I think it's extremely important to understand that what's going on in the world today, so many of these things are coordinated. So just because something happens in the US doesn't mean that something that happens very similar in Finland is not coordinated. You have to look at the NATO structure and the different alliances and so on. I tell you one thing, for instance, in Orlando now, there's this woman, I'm sure you've seen her, she's standing crying, saying, oh, my son is missing, I have no idea where she is. When you look in her glasses, you will see the reflections of all the lights behind the camera guy. Actually, she's in a green screen studio. But anyway, her name is Christine Leonen, which is Leionen, which is a Finnish, quite a normal Finnish name. And when you check, this has caused a massive reaction in Finland because she had a Finnish name. And right after this reaction happened in Orlando, there was one of the first type of similar shootings in Finland, causing a massive debate about weapons there. So I tell you, you need to see how it works. They're playing us, they're playing chess with the world, and the nations are just bricks on their domino game, in their domino game. So be aware of what is going on in different places on Earth at the same time.
Absolutely. Now, Ole, you've pulled together some of your research in your latest book, which is, I believe, called Coup d'etat in Slow Motion.
Yes, indeed. It's almost 900 pages about the assassination of Olof Palme. Who did it? Who was who was the backup shooters? The getaway cars, everything involved with names and pictures, everything, but also connected into the Iran-Contra scandal with the Bushes, also with the pedophile trafficking, all of these things, because they all work together. It is one big, massive network of a lot of awful stuff that is going on in this world.
Well,
the good news.
Say again?
The good news is that the people behind these things are very, very few compared to how many we are. I would say they're in the thousands, we are in the billions. So really, it should be very easy for us to stop this whole thing.
And the more people that are looking at it, and looking at it objectively, I mean, it may well be that the official version of events is exactly what occurred. But it's starting to look like that it would be the exception as opposed to the rule. So, we just ask people to look at it as objectively as you possibly can without any preconceived or predetermined ideas, but also taking cognizance of what has happened elsewhere and the scripts and looking at the common denominators. Now, with the situation in the UK with Tommy Mayer, we know that he was psychologically challenged, part of the usual profiling. He apparently hadn't taken his meds for a while, but for those who want to see the impact of these SSRIs, just search for SSRI database, and you will see there the effect that these pernicious pharmaceuticals have on those who take them. It's a common denominator in almost all high school shootings, in almost all assassinations, and yet, of course, these things are dished out like the proverbial Smarties. So please carry on.
That the information about these drugs are given to us very often by the same people who are behind these operations. So just because it's in the media does not mean that it's actually true. And if you want to look at the facts, look at this guy, Thomas Mayer, how he was arrested. Look at it. You can find it online. He's taken by there's one police car. They have grabbed him. He's face down in the street. And then 8 vehicles arrive with no blue lights, no adrenaline, no nothing. They just drive up and stop totally. I tell you, that thing is not real. If you ever seen 8 police cars pull up with no blue lights or no sirens, I mean, have you seen that in the UK? I don't believe it.
Well, and there was an event also last week, actually, that was very different. And, once again, this is all part of the conditioning to be able to kill, but this is official conditioning. Because in Wales last week, there was this Spencer Bainon, who was a former Iraqi veteran. And he was clearly, distressed and was behaving somewhat irrationally. And what happens? He's tasered. He's tasered, and of course the media immediately look for the opportunity to demonize him. Ex-soldier who turned to cannabis after losing comrades in Iraq bomb attack dies after being tasered by police. And of course even the headline there is programming, so that it throws in the drug to dilute the effect of the tasering. But, all too often now, we are seeing the police in the UK all too ready and rather too quickly to pull out the taser. Now, the reason I raise this is because this is the response to an individual that is very distressed. And, it does seem as though he'd attacked a dog and then turned the knife on himself. So, he was clearly not in a good psychological condition. But compare this response to the response to Thomas Mayer. And as you rightly say, the video footage that is available online, it was taken by a resident in the street where the arrest was carried out. And it really doesn't look like there's anything particularly serious going on at all.
Nope. And I tell you, I would very much like to see the medical examination or study that shows that people get aggressive from cannabis. That is an impossibility as far as I know.
Exactly. It didn't actually say that he'd been smoking it at the time, but of course you're absolutely right. It's more likely to be the Class A drugs that cause aggression. Cannabis does tend to have the opposite effect.
I would like to say, just because it's written in newspapers, I'm a former journalist, I would say question everything. Just use your normal logic mind. I use what I call Farmer Brown logic and really start looking into the different things. Just because it's there put on the screen in front of you or in a printed form, in a newspaper or whatever, question it. Just that is a healthy, just open mind that says, hang on, before I buy into this, who benefits from me believing it? And then just check it out for yourself. Because there's a lot of budget being put into media to force our minds into the direction that the people behind these power structures want us to go. I'm telling you.
Absolutely. Ole, we are just 3 days away from the EU referendum. Obviously, the establishment is using this event, regardless of how the event manifested, be it a genuine event, be it a random event, be it something contrived. But the establishment is using it to maximum effect, not only in terms of politicizing the case, to force or to encourage people to vote to remain in the EU, but it's also turning people who I would consider to be relatively passive, relatively moderate, into aggressive political animals. And this is all part of the conditioning that's occurring here. And sadly, I have to say that, obviously the mechanism is in place through postal votes for the vote to be manipulated. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if, regardless of the vote outcome, that it's announced that Britain will stay in the EU. And of course, the referendum isn't legally binding anyway. It's simply advisory, and ultimately it's up to Parliament to decide whether or not they ratify the result of the referendum. But if, as I sense, more and more people are starting to realize that to remain in the EU is to effectively forego any remnants of self-determination. So this isn't about xenophobic racism. It's about democracy. It's about the people, the multicultural people of this country having the capability and the capacity for self-determination. And if we don't have the confidence in those people or in ourselves to elect people to look after the best interests of the residents of this country, then we have a much, much deeper problem. Well, I have one public event between now and the referendum, and that is in Birmingham tomorrow, where I shall be speaking at Truth Juice. And the title of the talk is the EU referendum. Either way, you're screwed. Because even in the unlikely event that it's announced that the referendum was in favour of a Brexit, then I believe that there is an agenda in place which, once again, does not have the best interests of this country at heart. And the ultimate here is that it's down to each and every one of us. Whether Ole's right and whether there will be a future opportunity for a referendum, of course, only time will tell. But the likelihood is if we remain in, it's certainly going to be a lot more difficult in the future to extricate ourselves from this pernicious corporatocracy. Whereas if we come out, there at least is the opportunity to participate in how this country moves forward. And this is the key element, participation. Do we, the collective we, have the will to do what is right for future generations of this independent nation state? Or are we just going to say, no, we're not interested, and we're just going to give it away to the bureaucrats who are effectively in bondage to the global corporatists? So my thanks to Ole Dammegard for joining me this evening. This was episode 74 of Humanity vs. Insanity, and we'll be back next week to take a look at what occurred on voting day, Thursday, the 23rd of June, 2016. So I'll see you next Monday at 7:30.